share my screen with you. I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation and discuss, and as Robert said, you can put in the chat thing your questions, and I can answer them periodically throughout the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. And Robert and I had been talking about this presentation, and because I did the work on the Harriet movie, which I hope many of you have seen, and if you haven't, please see it. So throughout this PowerPoint, I do show some images from the film, and I may interject some information about the film as I go along. So here we go. Let's hope this works. There we go. Okay, let me move that up there. I added Enduring Legacy to this title of this presentation because there's something about Tubman that has made her memory and her story endure for 150 years or more, and certainly since her death in 1913. So I will be talking about that as well. So as Robert had mentioned, I did consult on the Harriet movie. I was contacted the year before the film came out, maybe 15 months before the film came out in the summer of 2018 by Casey Lemons, the director, who is there right in the center of the photograph, and a couple of the producers of the film. And they were working on the script. They had received the script from someone who had written it back in the 1990s, and it was filled with a tremendous amount of stereotypes and also a lot of misinformation, And Casey Lemons, the director, and the producers really wanted to center Tubman more in the film, in the script, and also to make it more accurate as they felt comfortable with in trying to squeeze a full life into 90 minutes feature film. So that's why they brought me in. And it was a great experience to work with Casey Lemons. She was magnificent. She was brilliant. She brought things to that script that I think only an African-American woman could. She really centered Tubman into the film. It was really wonderful. So what I'd like to talk to you about is the truth of Tubman's life and how remarkable it is that this enslaved woman came out of nowhere to do extraordinary things and to change the world. And in my view, she is still changing the world. Her legacy, her memory still inspires people today. So Harriet Tubman was born in 1822 on the, excuse me, on the eastern shore of Maryland. Maryland hugs the Chesapeake Bay on the western shore and eastern shore, and I have these red markers. She was born in Dorchester County, and she spent her life enslaved in Dorchester and neighboring Caroline County, and these are the places where she also conducted her rescue missions during the Underground Railroad days. These are the landscapes of her life, forests, rivers, streams, marshes. It's a very marshy area, agricultural fields. The eastern shore of Maryland is very flat, particularly Dorchester County. Dorchester County has no rocks, first of all. It is just soils that were deposited there, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, but no rocks, oddly enough. And the rocks that you find there are generally rocks that were brought in on ships that were coming in to pick up produce during the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, and they would dump all the rocks and then load up their ships and sail off. So anyway, there were no really naturally occurring rocks there. And I put this image of a church, a historic church, just to represent the not only the physical landscape, but the spiritual landscape of Tubman's life. She was deeply and profoundly spiritual and had strong faith. And so while there were a few churches, particularly for African Americans during her lifetime as an enslaved person on the Eastern Shore, African Americans did attend churches that were for white people, and also she worshiped with her family and members of her community when they could. During my research, it turns out there were a lot of documents related to her life that people didn't believe existed. And the book that I wrote that came out quite a few years ago, Bound for the Promised Land, was based on my dissertation. And for my dissertation, I spent years researching in archives and libraries, museums, courthouses, and just so many different places, private collections of people who had documents related to, say, abolitionists that knew Harriet Tubman. So some of the documents that I discovered were, these lists, and if you can see on the screen on the right side, is a list of 43 enslaved people. This was the inventory in a probate record for Anthony Thompson, and he was a very wealthy man in Dorchester County. He enslaved Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross. He did not enslave Harriet's mother or Harriet, who was born Araminta, or her siblings. Edward Brodess enslaved Rit, Harriet Tubman's mother, and all of the children. And in this probate record, there has been the first name on this list of 43 names. And Anthony Thompson, when he prepared his will as he lay dying, he set free all of his enslaved people. Not immediately, he gave them certain terms that they still had to serve. So Ben only had 1 year left to serve. And so he was set free in 1840. And the notation here is that his wife and children belonged to Edward Brodess. And this whole document actually is more than just a list of enslaved people, but it is a document about genealogy and family and community. This is the community of enslaved people and their extended family members that Tubman was born into. This is the community that helped raise her, educate her, protect her as she grew into an adult. And this photograph is a picture of the house that Anthony Thompson had built. It was built about 1810, and we believe that Harriet Tubman's father, Ben Ross, helped build that house. Tubman was born in 1822. She was the fifth of 9 children. She had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. When she was a small child, she was sent to live with Edward Brodess, who lived in Bucktown with a new wife, and he had a very small farm. Anthony Thompson had 1,000 acres in Dorchester County, about 10 miles from Bucktown. But Edward Brodess was a small-time farmer. He had inherited a very small farm. It was about 250 acres, but only about 140 of it was tillable. The rest was basically swamp. But he wanted his enslaved people with him. He didn't get along with his stepfather. Anthony Thompson was his stepfather. So when he became an adult and he got married, he moved to Bucktown, and then he brought Rit and all of the children with him to Bucktown. And this marked the turning point in Harriet Tubman's family. The Ross family was the name of her birth family, and they suffered greatly at the hands of Edward Brodess. He didn't make much money, and he had a lot of enslaved people, so he started to sell them. And during the 1820s, there were a lot of opportunistic slave traders from the Deep South who came to the eastern shore of Maryland and paid top dollar for enslaved people to take down to Mississippi and Alabama and the Deep South, and they would make a great profit by selling them there. So Tubman not only was taken away from Ben Ross and that community that I described at Anthony Thompson Plantation, but she and her mother and her siblings suffered even further loss when they arrived in Bucktown, because Edward Brodess began to sell some of her siblings, including Maria Ritty, who was one of her siblings, who was born in 1811. And she was 14 years old when Edward Brodess sold her to this man, Dempsey P. Kane, who was featured in this advertisement. And he was a Mississippi slave trader. And so that tore the family apart permanently. It was a dramatic and very tragic beginning for the separation of the family. Bucktown, the Brodess farm was about a mile from the Bucktown Village Store, which is the site of a very famous event in Tubman's life. When she was a teenager, 13 years old, she was had been hired away to another farmer in the area. Edward Brodess had too many enslaved people to use profitably on his farm, so he leased Tubman and her siblings out. And Tubman was about 13, and she was leased to a neighboring farmer. And the plantation cook had come to her a certain day in the fall of maybe 1835 or so, and asked her to go to the store with her because she needed goods for the kitchen. And Tubman didn't want to go because her hair was messy from working in the fields. And the cook was insistent, so Tubman later said in several interviews that her hair saved her life that day, because Tubman grabbed a shawl from the kitchen and wrapped her hair in it so it would hide how messy her hair was. When they arrived at the store, an overseer was chasing a young man who had fled his work assignment in a field. And the young man had fled into the back door or some way into the store and was fleeing out when Tubman was in the doorway, and she stepped aside for the young man to flee out, but the overseer yelled at her to stop the young man, which she did not do. And as soon as he fled the doorway, she stepped back into the doorway, and the overseer had picked up a weight from one of the scales on the dry goods store counter and threw it at the young man who had already exited the doorway, but it hit Tubman in the head and nearly killed her. It cracked her skull wide open and left her bleeding and unconscious on the floor of the store. So they carried her back to the plantation where she had been hired out, and they left her on the seat of a loom that was in the kitchen, a long bench in the kitchen, and they woke her up the next day and they forced her back out into the fields. But of course, with a serious head injury, she didn't last long and she collapsed and was returned to Edward Brodess, and it took her mother months to bring her back to health. But she suffered from seizures and headaches for the rest of her life. She described these seizures as coming on her. She would have no warning, and she would collapse on the ground. And sometimes she would imagine that she was flying above the earth. Other times she imagined that there was fire around her or running water. She could hear music. She could hear voices singing. She thought she heard God speaking to her. So while these seizures were very frightening to her, they also comforted her, particularly when she heard the voices, because she thought that God was protecting her. But people around her were worried when she would collapse in a field. They worried that, the overseer would come and beat her and make her work harder. But she survived this childhood trauma and became very, very strong and capable. This is an image from, that image that I just showed back there is an image from the film. This is Cynthia Erivo, the actress who played Tubman in the Harriet film. And this is a tintype that was made. A special photographer was hired by the film company to take tintype photographs. And those are old-fashioned photographs with a very, very old-fashioned camera. And it's placed, the photo film is placed on a piece of tin and printed. So here is a picture of Cynthia Erivo as an adult Tubman. And in real life, Tubman grew up and became very strong, and Edward Brodess hired her out to another landowner, a very wealthy family, the Stewart family. And they owned tremendous amount of property and businesses in Madison, in Dorchester County, which was very near where her father lived. So that brought her back to near her father, and that was an opportunity for her to learn from him. She worked in the Stewart house, then she worked in their fields, and then she worked on their docks, loading and unloading vessels that came in with goods. And she became very, very strong. And according to her own testimony, she was the marvel of the stewards and also other slave owners in the area, because she was so tiny. She was 5 feet tall, but she could carry as much weight and as many goods as an adult male could. So she was earning quite a reputation for herself. Edward Brodess eventually made an agreement with her. She would pay him $60 a year, and then she could hire herself out to whomever she pleased. And because she was such a hard worker and she was such a great entrepreneur, she earned more money than the $60 so that she could provide more things for herself, including buying 2 oxen, which of course increased her earning potential by plowing more fields and hauling more logs. It also offered her the opportunity to work with her father in the woods. He was a skilled lumberjack. He was a timber foreman. He was a carpenter, a ship carpenter, very, very well-respected, talented man who by 1840 was free. So she learned how to survive in the woods. She learned how to read the night sky. And when she was working on those docks, she learned to connect with the black mariners who worked many of the ships that came in and out of the county, and also who plied the waters of the Chesapeake all the way out to the Atlantic and throughout New England. From them, she learned the amazing communication network that black mariners had. She also could hear about news from far away. She learned about the safe places and the places that were dangerous. She made important connections and learned important things from them during these years that she was hiring herself out. In 1844, she married a free black man by the name of John Tubman. He was just a couple of years older than she was. He was freeborn of free parents. In Dorchester County, where Harriet Tubman was born and raised, about half the black population was free, and half the population was black. So there were about 20,000 residents for several decades in the mid-1800s, and half the population was white, half was black, and half of that black population was enslaved. So most black families had both free and enslaved family members. It's just the nature of slavery in Maryland and on the Eastern Shore. And this is a scene from the film where they depict Harriet with her husband, John. But in 1849, Edward Brodess died. He was still, he was 47 years old. I don't know what he died of. It may have been some fever or virus. But he left behind a wife and 8 children, 6 of whom were still minors. He had 6 sons and 2 daughters. And in the film, they don't show all of those children. And one of the characters is Gideon, who is the young gentleman there. This is supposed to be a scene from the funeral of Edward Brodess. And Gideon is sort of the bad guy in the film. There was no son named Gideon, and their eldest son was 5 years younger than Tubman was. But they did a good job showing the nature of some white families and the way the enslaved men the men in the enslavers' family treated their slaves, and how they posed a risk to young enslaved women every single day. When Edward Brodess died, he left his wife, Eliza Brodess, in deep, deep debt. He was a lousy businessman. He was a terrible farmer. He was a terrible person. He had sold away 2 more of Harriet Tubman's sisters. Lina and Soph were both sold away. Both of them sold away from their children. So he further tore that family apart. But in 1849, after he died, Eliza Brodess had few assets, but all these young children she still needed to take care of. So she knew that she had to sell some of her enslaved people. And so she started to try to sell Keziah, who was Harriet Tubman's niece, the daughter of Lina, who had been sold away. And Keziah was married to a free man, and she had 2 little children, but of course they were enslaved like she was. and they were set to be auctioned. But Keziah's husband, John Boley, tried to stop the auction, hoping he could purchase his wife. So the auction was postponed until September 17th. But Harriet Tubman knew that once that auction happened, then she and her brothers were going to be sold as well. So on the day that Keziah was supposed to be sold, she and her brothers, Ben and Henry, escaped. They fled from neighboring Caroline County. And this is the advertisement that was posted by Eliza Brodus 2 weeks after Harriet Tubman had fled with her brothers. And in this ad, it's very descriptive. It describes her brother Henry, who was known as Harry. He was 19 years old. He was 5, 8, or 9 years old. Ben, who was a younger brother as well, he was about 25, about 6 feet tall. And Minty, Harriet Tubman, named Minty at birth, age 27 years old, chestnut color, and fine looking, about 5 feet tall. She offered $50 reward for each enslaved person if they were caught near Dorchester County, or $100 if they were caught outside of Maryland. So slave catching was a business in slave states. There were young men that would go out and they would hunt down enslaved people who had escaped. Harriet and her brothers, Ben and Henry, according to her testimony, stayed away for about 3 weeks. They tried desperately to get away, and they were confused about which way to go, and they were afraid because they felt that if they were caught, they risked everything. So they returned to Caroline County. But Tubman knew that she was going to be sold, so she fled by herself. And this time she approached a neighboring woman, a Quaker woman, who had apparently told her that if she ever needed help to please come to her. So Tubman went to this Quaker woman. We're not exactly sure who she was. It was one of 2 women that lived near where Tubman was in Caroline County. And this woman told her to sweep the front yard until her husband came home, and then her husband would take her to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. And Tubman did that, and she was transported along this Underground Railroad until she reached the Pennsylvania line. And this is a scene from the film, but Tubman describes this in her own testimony about what happened. And I'm just going to read this for you. She said, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." And here's a depiction of that in the film, and they do a great job with it. But you can just imagine that feeling that she had, that she was free, that everything seemed brighter and more beautiful. But once she reached Philadelphia, she realized that freedom wasn't complete without her family. So she was determined to return to rescue her family and friends. And it was at great risk to herself, great risk. People were betrayed all the time. And there were very few agents like Harriet Tubman. People would escape, and very, very rarely would they go back to rescue anyone. And those that did generally went back once and didn't go back again. Harriet Tubman went back, we've documented, about 13 times and rescued about 70 family and friends. And she gave instructions to about 70 more who found their way to freedom on their own. Harriet Tubman testified many times in front of audiences later during, before the Civil War and after the Civil War, that she made 8 or 9 trips to Maryland and rescued about 40 to 50 people, but we've been able to document a few more. But she, you know, she was forced to do amazing things like wade through rivers, and she didn't know how deep they were, and no one could swim. And, but she just relied on her instincts, her great intelligence, and her ability to use those trust networks on the Underground Railroad through the Black Mariners And also her deep faith guided her every single day. The seaports were an important place where networks to freedom existed. And there were so many people along the networks that helped her. Down on your left-hand side in the corner is Reverend Samuel Greene, who was a free Black minister in Dorchester County. He was a secret Underground Railroad agent. He helped Tubman several times. He's credited with helping at least 25 people, not all of them associated with Harriet Tubman. He ended up being arrested in 1857 on suspicion that he helped people escape, but the jury, all-white jury, found him not guilty. So they brought new charges on him. That he owned a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in Maryland it was illegal for African Americans to own abolitionist literature. And they determined that Uncle Tom's Cabin was abolitionist literature, so he was tried and convicted and sent to prison for 10 years. And then there's Thomas Garrett here on the right. He was a Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware, and he's credited with helping about 2,500 people, if not more, escape through the Underground Railroad over a 40-year period. And this woman up here is a character in the film. Her name is Marie Buchanan. And there was a real woman by the name of Mrs. Buchanan who ran a boarding house in Philadelphia who helped freedom seekers. She also boarded Black mariners. So she plays an important role in Tubman's life and in the life of many freedom seekers who went through the city. William Still was a very famous Underground Railroad agent in Philadelphia. He was incredibly important to that network coming out of the Chesapeake region into Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was a big city. It had the largest free Black population in the country at the time, so freedom seekers could blend in more easily there than other places. And William Still kept a journal that still survives. It's at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where he recorded the names of many of the freedom seekers that came through his house. He helped over 2,000 people. We don't have the records for all of them, but he did publish a book in 1870 where he gives testimony about many of these people. And this is a page from when Tubman rescued her brothers at Christmas 1854, and he writes about her coming through with her brothers and other people. It's a magnificent document, and you could see it online for yourself at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Her network spanned all over Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all of New England, New York, and into Canada. And we have a Tubman Park in Maryland, and we have an interactive at the visitor center where you can hit all these different names and figure out how they're all connected. And we only had space for 50 names, and there are many, many more that Tubman connected with, which is remarkable given that she didn't have a cell phone, she didn't have the internet, she didn't have social media. She did this all in person, and she was so brilliant on how she worked this amazing network of people who helped her get other people to freedom. When the Civil War started, Governor John Andrews of Massachusetts, who knew her, he had met her because she had come to Boston several times and met some of the most remarkable abolitionists that lived here. And he thought it would be great if she could go down to South Carolina and help with the war effort, because he admired her military genius, her ability to navigate landscapes, and that she might be a great spy. And she turned out to be an amazing spy after all. She had a group of 8 Black male scouts that worked for her, and she was extremely well respected by Union Army generals and officers. And she worked very closely with Colonel James Montgomery of the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers. And she and her scouts helped concoct this plan to go up the Combahee River in June of 1863 and rout out all the rebel forces and liberate enslaved people. And they did this, and they burned down plantations, and they rescued about 750 people. And she was credited with leading this raid. I know there were skeptics out there, but she was credited with it. And it was published in the newspapers that this raid was led by the Black She Moses. And so she was remarkable. And throughout the war, she did whatever spying she could do. She did nursing and cooking and did amazing things to support the cause for the United States. There's one quote that she gave to a professor at Harvard later in her life when she was describing the war, and I just want to read this to you because it is incredibly poetic. She actually saw the Massachusetts 54th go into battle. She said she served Robert Gould Shaw his last meal, and she saw them die. She said she buried the dead, and she nursed some of them in the hospitals. And this is what she said about that great battle at Fort Wagner. And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was the dead that we reaped. It's remarkable. It is just remarkable. She's such vivid language. After the war, she moved to Auburn, New York, where she had purchased a 7-acre farm from William Henry Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, and his wife, Frances. She had purchased it before the war in 1859, and her family settled there while she was waging her own battle and fighting in the war in the South. Today, it is a national park, and it is a park site. This is an image of the brick home that she built after her wood frame home burned down in 1880, and this is the 1882 house that she built. That isn't open to visitors yet, but it will be soon. And this is a photograph of her with her family. This is Tubman over here. She's holding a pan that she used to feed the chickens just before the photograph was taken. This is her second husband, Nelson Davis. John Tubman did not follow her north. He was a free man with a free life. He did not want to leave his freedom behind, and it would have been a great risk if he had tried to leave with her. So he married another woman, so Tubman felt that she was free to marry again. And John Tubman actually, by the way, was killed in 1867. A white neighbor got mad at him and shot him, killed him, and that was the end of John Tubman. But Nelson Davis was 22 years younger than Tubman. He was a soldier in the 8th U.S. Colored Volunteers. And they adopted a little girl by the name of Gertie, the young woman who's standing between them. They adopted her in the 1870s. This is a neighbor girl, Lee Cheney. And Tubman always took in orphans and the elderly who were sick, anyone who needed help. This young boy, Walter Greene, was an orphan. She took him in and raised him. And on the far right is a niece, Dora Stewart. So Tubman had settled in St. Catharines during the late 1850s. And after the war, most of her family moved to Auburn to be with her, as well as many of the freedom seekers that fled with her and moved to St. Catharines followed her to Auburn after the war as well. She helped establish the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church in Auburn, New York, which is now a national park site, and they are renovating that and making it ready for visitors. And her dream Tubman's dream had always been to open a home for the aged because there were no facilities for African Americans at the time, all of the facilities for whites only. So in 1896, the 25-acre property abutting her 7-acre farm came up for sale, and she purchased it. She had no money, but people rallied around her and helped her raise the down payment. And so she established the Home for the Aged, which is this building up on the right-hand corner that you see. And today, it's part of her home property, which is also a park. And you can go inside the Home for the Aged and see how it is set up. But it's a beautiful, beautiful property. And we're looking forward to really getting it to where it was back in Tubman's day. She was a lifelong suffragist. She often said that she had fought in war and she deserved to have the vote just like her brothers and everybody else. And unfortunately, she did not live long enough to be able to vote. She attended as many conventions as she could. She was very good friends with Susan B. Anthony, and she admired Anthony very much, and Anthony admired her too. And sadly, neither one of them was able to vote. This is the last known photograph of Harriet Tubman. It's taken, I think, in the fall of 1912. She died on March 13th, 1913. She was 91 years old. And that year, the New York Times listed at the end of the year the 250 most important people who have died in the world that year, and Harriet Tubman was one of them. Out of the 250, there were only 25 women, and Harriet Tubman was one of those women. So she was very famous when she died. But since then, her memory was never really lost. She was celebrated always, particularly in the Black community, but even in the white community. And by the 1980s, school children knew her as one of the most famous Americans of all time, right up there with Paul Revere and George Washington. So today, after much work, we have the National Park and State Park in Maryland. These are scenes from that park visitor center in Maryland. It's been open for 3 years. It's beautiful. Someday, when we all can travel again, you should go and visit. It's magnificent. We have a 126-mile Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Scenic Byway and All-American Road that goes through Dorchester and Caroline County. And now it's picked up another 90 miles in Delaware. The state of Delaware has created their byway, and then 20 more miles from the border into Pennsylvania over to Philadelphia. And our dream is that someday we take it from Philadelphia to New York City, to Albany, and across to Auburn and to Niagara Falls. So Tubman, her legacy, her power, her message of freedom and equality and justice and self-determination has just resonated for Americans for 150 years. And today, people are still celebrating her. And it wasn't just because of the parks, it's like children everywhere. This is the group Magpie. They go around to different schools and they work with anywhere from 4th to 7th graders, and they compose music about Harriet Tubman or the abolition movement or freedom, and they perform these pieces of music they've written in the spirit of Harriet Tubman. These children up here on the right-hand side are from Niagara Falls in Ontario, Canada, and they were determined to celebrate Harriet Tubman at Niagara Falls, and they petitioned the Niagara Parks Commission to put a plaque and tell Tubman's story about bringing people across the suspension bridge there across the great river. And the children were so cute because they were like from 3rd grade to 5th grade, and they had to go in and make speeches. And they did a wonderful job, and you can imagine those commissioners could not say no to those little children standing there with their little papers reading their speeches. So here they are unveiling the proposed plaque that was now there permanently. And down here on the lower left corner are these tunnel boring machines. Many years ago, Miami was digging a tunnel under the bay somewhere, I'm not sure where, and they had a naming contest for the tunnel boring machine. And the Girl Scouts down there nominated Harriet Tubman, and they decided to name the machine after Tubman because she just kept moving on. And Los Angeles didn't want to be outdone, and they have 2 boring machines for their tunnel project, and they've named them after Harriet Tubman as well. And here is the magnificent statue by Allison Sarr in New York City of Harriet Tubman. And of course, she's been voted to be on the $20 bill, and Secretary Lou of the Treasury from last administration said that she would go on the 20, and we are still waiting. And how fantastic would that be, that every single day you get money out of a machine, and there's Harriet Tubman reminding you to fight, fight, fight every single day. Because we need to be reminded, because there are still people out there today that are waving those Confederate and Nazi flags that deny people their freedom and their rights. And this is today in America, and it's wrong. And we need Harriet Tubman to remind us to reach out and do the right thing and connect with each other and inspire each other and to move forward and celebrate and make sure that everyone experiences justice and equality. And I'm closing with this beautiful picture of Cynthia Erivo from the film, standing with two Tubman relatives, Judy Bryant over here and Tina Wyatt over here. And this is from the premiere of the film at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. So let's not forget Harriet Tubman. Let's remember her and celebrate her, and people like her who fight every single day, because she fought for freedom, family, faith, and her community. She persisted, she never stopped, and that's what we should be doing too. So thank you.
Great job, Kate. Kate, let me give you some questions and comments from the chat.
All right.
And then we can open things up and allow people to ask questions via video or audio.
All right. Should I do the stop share? I'll take that down.
You know what? Why don't you keep it up for now?
Okay.
And then when you stop sharing, I will end the recording. That way, folks who ask questions via video, they won't be captured on the recording.
Okay.
Corliss wants to know, could you please expand on the relationship between Frances Seward and Harriet Tubman?
Frances Seward and Harriet Tubman. So everyone talks about Tubman's relationship with William Seward, but from my research, I see that Tubman's relationships are the women behind all these powerful men. So the Sewards lived in Auburn. Their home was a mile from the home that she purchased from the Sewards. Frances Seward's father, Elijah Miller, owned the farm that Tubman ended up purchasing, and he passed away, and Frances Seward basically inherited it, and that's the farm that she purchased. And Tubman loved Frances. She loved their whole family, their daughter Fanny, their sons. They managed the property for her. She owed them money, and eventually the family forgave the debt that she owed them on the property, and so she could own it free and clear. They were a remarkable family. They stood behind her and for her and by her throughout her life.
Great. Anne has a comment, just wanted to say that 1 year ago today, I visited the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park in Maryland, and it's a marvelous sight.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Donna Weiss wanted to know, and I think we know the answer to this, but maybe you can expound on it. How was Harriet Tubman regarded by the Confederacy?
Well, I don't know. Well, by the Confederacy at the time, during the day, during the Civil War, they did not know exactly who she was, but they were appalled when she was celebrated in newspapers for leading that road on the raid on the Combahee River. And in fact, there was a newspaper from the South. They printed few newspapers during the Civil War, but there was one newspaper that printed an interview with one of the plantation owners along the Combahee River, whose plantation was burned down. And he reported seeing the steamboats come up the river, and he swore he saw a woman standing on the bow of the ship. And guess what? Yes, she was there on the bow of that ship. So, but they didn't know who she was. And in fact, even during the Underground Railroad days, they didn't know who Tubman was. They had no idea that this little 5-foot-tall, disabled, formerly enslaved woman was bringing people away from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. She was so clever. She was so smart and ingenious that, you know, they just couldn't figure out what was happening. They actually thought by the end of the 1850s that it was a white abolitionist man dressed in blackface as a woman who was leading people away. I mean, that's really twisted thinking to come up with that.
So Barbara had two questions. How did Harriet know where the combi was if she was not if she never was there? And do we know whatever happened to Gertie?
Gertie, we don't know what happened to Gertie. Sadly, she contracted syphilis, and but we don't. I'm assuming that she died from syphilis, but we don't know what happened to her after 1893. We don't know. And how did Tubman know about the Combahee River? So, as I said, she had been sent down to South Carolina by Governor John Andrews, and she set up shop as a spy and, you know, the whole thing down there. And so she was stationed at Port Royal and Beaufort, and that's right near the Combahee River. And she worked with these scouts, these men who had connections, who had escaped from plantations along the Combahee River and other rivers. So they had done lots of spying, and she went with them. So she was comfortable in that landscape because it's all marshes. They have alligators. She didn't have alligators in the Chesapeake, but she was used to the water and used to landscapes of marshes. So she was able to navigate that landscape with the help of those spies.
So Ed was wondering where you got, where you found all your records and documents, and how you did your research for the book.
So I started researching in New England because I was getting my PhD at the University of New Hampshire. So it was just incredible, the amount of material that's here in New England because of all the abolitionists, and all their papers are still here. So the Boston Public Library and Smith College and the Antiquarian Society and the Boston Athenaeum and all these other different places, and throughout New York, Syracuse and Auburn and New York City, and so many different archives. And people wrote letters and they described Tubman, they talked about her, they dated things that she was here then, and this is what she'd said, and they'd quote her. And they would interview her, and they would post interviews in newspapers. So all that was in the north. And then I went down to Maryland, not expecting to find anything, but the courthouse had burned in 1852, so any records I had lost hope of finding. But actually, the townspeople had raced into the courthouse when it was burning and pulled records out, so there were many that were saved. And that way, I was able to look at records. And because enslaved people were property, there were a lot of records dedicated to enslaved people. So Harriet Tubman and all of her family, their records are there. And so I was able to piece together this remarkable life story of Harriet Tubman because so many people were so good at leaving records behind.
All right, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to stop with the chat questions. You can stop sharing your screen. Okay, excellent. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay.